Robert, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So, can you give myself and the audience a little background about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Robert Anderson. I'm the chairman and CEO of Cyber Defense Labs. Our main headquarters is based out of Dallas, Texas. We're a full service cybersecurity company that does both proactive and reactive cyber for any company out there. Background, I've been the chairman and CEO for the last 4 going on 5 years out here in Dallas. Prior to that, I was an FBI agent for 21 years. And prior to that, I was a Delaware State Trooper for 9 years. And in the FBI, when I retired, I finished as the executive assistant director. I had about 24,000 of the 34,000 people in the FBI working under me. And I was in charge of all global criminal and all global cyber operations and, a bunch of other stuff. But that's pretty much it.
So, was there your introduction into cyber? Was that something you chose to do, or was
No,
that just kind of the course of your career that you just happened to get put in charge of something or learn about something and said, "Hey,
no.
we should have Robert do that"?
Yeah, no, it's funny. It's a good question. And what I would tell you is it's the evolution of what I've seen criminal activity and nation state activity become. It wasn't anything in my career that all of a sudden said I was going to go do cyber. When I went into the state police, it was 1986, and you had a Plymouth Fury that was about the size of your studio and a radio with 3 channels on it. And back in those days, for a bad guy to hurt you, that bad guy had to break into your house or touch you or physically accost you. Well, fast forward 30 years later, around 2010, 2011, the FBI really started to focus on this stuff called virtual currency. And all of us were going, like, what's virtual currency? What's that? Matter of fact, the laws weren't even written
Yeah.
for virtual currency, right? It's like tangible property. Well, this isn't tangible. And so by the end of my career, before I retired in 2015 and went out to the private sector, literally every conversation every day with the director or the attorney general of the United States or Congress or Senate was focused on cyber terrorism, cyber counterintelligence, cyber criminal activity. So it was really an evolution over 30 some years of watching how bad guys did it, that it really evolved into cyber. And hence why, for the last 8 years in the private sector, I've been out doing cyber stuff.
So you mentioned that your company works on kind of the proactive side and the reactive side. Can you talk about what those are and what the differences are?
Yeah, that's a good point. So and by the way, I'm a big believer in anything you can do before something bad happens is the best thing for your company. Coming into a company after a major cyber breach is like showing up at a car accident. You can fix it, investigate it, but you didn't prevent it. And so our company has 2 sides of it. Really, one side is it's the proactive coming in and looking at your policies and procedures. Are you prepared for a breach, a ransomware attack? Do you know what to do with your data? Is your company resilient? Do you have, segmented data, resilient data? Can you get your data back? Most people house it now, quote, in the cloud, and they've never tested it. They tell you can get it back in 24 hours, but can you? Most breaches I've been involved in, the answer is no. And then the other side of the house is putting protection up around your firewalls and outside at your endpoints, looking at your managed services side of the house to determine, hey, are there bad guys knocking on your door trying to get in? And that's really the 2 sides of our company. And then obviously we try to surround that because once the breach happens, it's beyond a business interruption, right? It's a critical incident to your company that could be, unfortunately, the demise of the company if you don't handle it correctly and
Hmm.
very quickly.
So we're talking about. I like when you talk about the backup thing. I come from a
Mhm.
small business background,
Yep.
and one of the companies that I originally went to start to work for them, they said, "Oh yeah," I was like, "Okay, so what's the setup here? What's how are you
Right.
backing up critical data?" And they said, "Oh, we've this is our backup solution,"
Yep.
and I was like, where are the instructions for it? Because it was a
Yeah.
platform that I wasn't. I was like, gosh, this thing's pretty old. Like, what are the
Yeah.
instructions for it? And they're like, well, the last guy had it. I'm like, well, do you
Yep.
know where he put the instructions? No.
Yep.
The company was no longer even in business, didn't have a
Right.
website. So while they had this backup software running, there was no process in place on how to recover it. There was no once I started poking into it, it started asking for a
Yeah,
password, and I'm like, does anyone know what the password is?
right.
So it's like that's one of the things I've always talked to people about. It's like, yeah, it's great that you know how to back up something, that you've got a backup process in place, but have you ever actually tried to recover it?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I got to tell you, and I did thousands of breaches inside the FBI, and I've done thousands outside in the private sector. Unfortunately, companies still don't do this. I mean, they all know they need redundancy data. They all know they need segmented data. They all know that they need to be able to restore their systems. But most companies are like, good at making this cup, right? That's why they're a company. They're good at
Yeah,
making this cup. They're not necessarily good, and that's why they need, I think nowadays, because it's so sophisticated, the attack vectors of good partnerships with cybersecurity companies and or IT firms, because that's two sides of the house, right?
yeah,
That actually make their systems safer. And the point you raised, and I'm telling you, I see this unfortunately in 90% of the large companies they work with, even with their incident response plans. If you sit down and do a tabletop, if you sit down and just run them through a mock incident, they'll go, well, who has that piece? Well, that was Jim or that was Sally. Well, they retired 2 years ago or they got transferred over here. They have a plan and it like would pass an audit. But as
yeah.
far as functionally operating that plan, almost non-existent most of the time. And if you think about it, these are really the basics. This isn't anything advanced, right? This is doesn't even cost you any money.
Yeah.
You just need to exercise the plan. And the one thing that I would say here, Chris, too, that's very important, and I say this a lot. Nowadays, I don't care if you're a 10-person company or a 100,000 person company, you need to make cyber and the problems that occur with it, with today's type of nation state and criminal organizations, a daily conversation. You need to not structure your whole life around it, but you need to have these conversations internally with a leadership team to say, hey, have we done this in a while? Or hey, are we familiar with the latest version of ransomware that's out there? Casual conversations, not a line item. And that'll keep you much more abreast than the way I think we used to do it, where you just make it as a line item, put a plan in a book someplace, and you can't even activate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to, the public opinion or the conventional wisdom of, hey, if you're a victim of ransomware, don't pay it, restore from backup. That works great if you've ever restored anything from backup, but if you haven't,
Yeah. Well,
that becomes
I tell
problematic.
you, unfortunately, and by the way, people should be aware, right? The laws on ransomware and what the government's view on that has changed dramatically in the last year. When I first retired in 2015, the practice and company I was running at the time, I would tell you, we paid for the clients hundreds of ransoms, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ransoms. Why? Because most of the clients that we went in and engaged with, we'd say, hey, do you have backup? Sure. And guess what? They weren't existent. And so now all of a sudden the company's going, wait a minute, I'm going to go out of business or do I pay this ransom? And again,
Yeah.
it's the company's decision, not mine. But the reality was, I will tell you, a large majority of them defaulted to paying that ransom. And so it promulgates this criminal enterprise of ransomware around the world. And it's not because they want to pay it, it's because they're in a situation where they've not taken those measures or steps. And unfortunately, they have to pay it. Otherwise, the organization is going to go bankrupt. And I really was surprised over the years. I've not seen a lot of change in that. Now, in the last year, with the government and the Department of Justice and the way that they're looking at this, companies need to be very careful on doing that. I think they need to consult with outside law firms before they even think about it because they're taking a harder line look on it with the victim, meaning the company, than the bad guy. And it's changed a lot. But unfortunately, when I came out of the government, everybody was paying ransoms. And even now today, that's one of the first things we talk to clients about is, hey, what are you doing on this and what are you going to do? And like you said earlier, exercising and making sure, check but verify that you can actually get this stuff back.
So, with respect to ransomware payments, since you actually have personal, client experience with this,
Yeah.
is it even somewhat more of a pragmatic thing of like, well, yes, we do have the backups. Let's say we even do have backups in place, but we know that that process is going to take us hours, days, weeks to restore everything. but the ransom, and that's going to cost, there's an opportunity cost, there's a financial cost to being down while you recover
Yep.
everything. Is it
Yep.
sometimes that pragmatic decision of, well, us being down is going to cost us $10 million, let's
Yep.
say, and the ransom's only $500,000. It's
Mhm.
just a pure financial decision. Let's just pay the 5,000 to be back up and running quicker, and then we can now start to play cleanup so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I would say it's a little of both. It seems to me, and in my experience with a lot of these things, the larger the company, the more complicated this becomes, right? And depending how bad the adversaries have actually engaged throughout the company. So if there's only a piece of the company locked up versus the entire global corporation locked up. But the biggest learning point out of this is the time to talk about it is today, not during the ransomware. And what I find is the majority of companies, again, they're really good at building a cup or whatever they make. They don't take that time to say, what if? What if this happens? How are we going to do it? And so it becomes really critical incident management because you've got a company now that's in a bad situation and now they're trying to manage this on the fly. And so the biggest part of this, whether you think you're going to have to pay it or not pay it, and I would default to not if you can, right? With your segmented redundancy and knowing when you can get your data back. That's a big key. You pointed it
Yeah.
out. Sometimes it takes weeks, especially if it's a large company, if your data is commingled someplace and they don't even realize it is. But the reality is, you know what you need to do prior to the incident. And in most of these cases, unfortunately, I will tell you that I've been involved in over the years, it's not. It's a reaction to the accident, right? It's a reaction to the breach. And that's a bad place to be. And I will tell you this too, you know, 8 years ago, ransoms were routinely $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. These things nowadays are millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And what people don't realize, if they haven't even understood, well, where do you get virtual currency? There's hundreds of versions of virtual currency. How long is it going to take me to procure this? How am I going to get it? How am I going to pay? You get what I'm saying? There's a lot of
Yeah.
complications there. Even down to that, you really need to understand the process because that will also impact your thought and your rationale on what's going on in the company. And my bigger thing is be a consumer and be aware of what's out there. You don't need to be the expert, right? But you need to be aware of what's going on. You can call in the experts, but understand what other companies are, especially if they're in the same business line as you, right? We see this all the time. You know, we have an immense amount of large banks as clients, right? One bank gets hit, you might as well start calling the other banks, right? Because
Yeah.
they're all going to get hit. It's the same way with manufacturing and healthcare and on and on and on. And just be an avid consumer of understanding what's going on around you, I think is a big help.
So you talked about companies having kind of reactive, to
Mm-hmm.
incident response in terms of like, okay, it's happening now. What do we do?
Mm-hmm.
Is the sort of thing with the conversations they need to have are similar to when we were kids. There was always the quarterly fire drill at school. Okay, when the bell goes off, okay, you get up, you go out this door, you go out that door. This class always lines up at this spot. Is that the sort of kind of analogy of
Yep.
of planning? Okay, if we have ransomware, here's who, like, we may not be able to solve it ourselves, but we
Yep.
know this is the company that we call, as opposed to, hey, let's start getting referrals now.
100%. Matter of fact, one of the things I recommend, and it should be beyond every board meeting. It shouldn't just be like 4 times a year. But the reality is, you should have on speed dial the outside law firm that you're going to call. And by the way, the day you meet them shouldn't be the day of the breach. You should meet them, have them in, talk to them, interview them, make sure you're comfortable with them, make sure they are absolute experts in whatever you're hiring them for. And the reason I say that, even if you're a large company and you have a general counsel with a very large lawyer staff, it doesn't matter. That man or
Yeah.
woman is going to be completely overwhelmed from the CEO and board on running whatever's going on in the company. You need that outside support. So I would have a list of cybersecurity firms, incident response firms. You're obviously, if you have cyber insurance, that's a whole nother conversation. You know, I could talk about that for days. Um, and then who's your outside law firm, virtual currency, all that. And you should have already met these people, or somebody on your team should have met them. And you have that prepared for the worst case scenario instead of trying to scramble for it and kind of catch as catch can during an incident. It's the best way to do it.
Yeah. Uh, Earlier, you were talking about the government stance on ransomware payments changing. What and you kind of alluded to it. What specifically is that change that
Well,
way the government's viewing it now?
yeah, I mean, it's a lot more focused back on, in my opinion, the company that is potentially been attacked by a bad guy. It doesn't matter who it is, nation state, criminal organization, it doesn't matter. And if they are going to now pay a ransom to that, there's very tight guidelines that DOJ is looking at is this a legal thing to do? Are you violating any type of audits or fiscal responsibility, depending on what business sector you're in, right? There's a whole bunch of those. And they're holding companies accountable. Now, look, I don't necessarily agree with that philosophy. I think there has to be a middle ground someplace. And you also need companies, and they're not there yet, trust me, that aren't afraid to go to the government for help, right? They don't want to immediately go and then all of a sudden, wait a minute, you're digging into all the stuff about my company and holding me responsible. And there's still a hesitancy, especially with large companies, to do that. So there needs to be a better way of doing it. When I first retired, and in 2016, 2017, 2018, it was like the wild, wild west in cyber. The incident when you had ransomware involved was extremely high. The ability to try to decrypt that on your own is almost non-existent nowadays because the hexadecimal codes and algorithms that the bad guys or bad gals use, you can bring in the FBI, the CIA, DOD, NSA, you're not going to break it.
Yeah.
And so you default to, okay, wait a minute, now I can't run my company, hence pay the ransom. And so I think people don't understand that. And what I advocate is you need to be informed and understand these laws, right? Before you even get near a ransomware thing, because inadvertently, as a CEO or a chairman of a board, you may make a decision that has civil or legal complications for your own company. And it's just something somebody should be smart about. You probably know, and it's kind of disjointed, but literally, like every state in the country has a different statute that says
Yeah.
this is what constitutes a breach, right? So depending if you're in Delaware or California or Texas, you might not have got breached, but it's up to the legal entity and the cybersecurity firm working with you forensically to say, did you actually have to report this? If you got a publicly traded company, do you need to make an announcement or not? So it's very complicated nowadays. And again, I think a lot of it is making a daily conversation and be aware of what's going on in your surroundings. That's the biggest piece of this, in my opinion.
And so, just one more thing about
Yeah.
the government stance is some of the concern. This money is going to fund terrorism or criminal organizations, and therefore, if you're giving money to the criminals, like, we're not sure we're okay
Yeah.
with that.
No, it is. I mean, there's definitely that. I also think, though, you want my honest opinion,
Yeah.
it's more them trying to get a handle on this whole problem, right? They need to stop the promulgation. The reason why ransomware is so prevalent, it's $1 trillion industry. I mean, bad guys are making a lot of money off this. And it's funny because when I came out, coming from 30 years of law enforcement, every time we work with a company and they said, oh, we want to pay the ransom, can you help us do this, this, this? I always said to my team, they're never going to give us the code. Well, I've got news for you. I've never not received the code
Yeah.
back from the bad guys because it's a business,
Yeah.
right? And so there's this chicken or the egg thing here. And I think the government is trying, don't get me wrong, you got men and women killing themselves 24 hours a day to protect the country out there. I think they're trying to curtail this. I think, though, what needs to happen, and I've been a big proponent of this, you really need to make it, because this is such a large problem nowadays, it really needs to be the private sector, the government, and private cyber corporations that work together to curtail this issue.
Yeah.
Because there's just not enough men and women. I could say from being in it, there's not enough men and women in the USIC or in the federal law enforcement community to handle this threat. There's too many breaches. It's thousands of these things a day. And I don't think people realize that. And it's just, in the FBI, when I ran the cyber program, we'd open up a lot of cases, but, I ran Ed Snowden, I ran OPM, I ran Sony. Like that's the cases we opened, right? Well, there's thousands of little companies and medium companies that are getting hit just as hard that would never rise. You get what I'm saying, to
Yeah.
that level. And so I think we just need a better philosophy on that. But I think this is, my opinion, is this the first step of the government trying to curtail that, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, there's this weird level of ethics in ransomware scammers.
Yep.
There's not enough ethics, so they're willing to commit criminal acts, but there's enough ethics for them to be able to say, well, we have to give the ransomware key if the ransom is paid, otherwise no one's ever going to pay the ransom.
That's right. It's not
It's a
going to be a business.
it's a
And
very
it
weird
literally is
balance.
a trillion-dollar business. I mean, there's a
Oh,
lot of money to be made at that, unfortunately. And now, nowadays, in the old days, I always say the old days of cyber, like 3 years ago, like that's the old days. But when I first started back in 2010, 2011, 2012, when we started really hitting cyber hard, both for cyber and all these other, whether it's counterterrorism, criminal, or counterintelligence, back in those days, the men and women that attack companies actually knew how to hack, right? And what people don't understand nowadays, the reason why I think this has proliferated to large scale criminal and small scale, but large money criminal organization is because you don't need to be a hacker anymore, right? I can go on the dark web, I can go on the Tor router, I can hire somebody to hack you, I can buy your PCI or
yeah.
PHI or PII, right? And this is some of the things I think when you talk about educating people, they need to understand like that's real. That's not some made up thing. And so for me to launch an attack against 10,000 banks in the United States, I can subcontract that out. And nowadays, you don't need to be a hacker, right? And so that's a big deal. Like in the old days, you needed to know how to hack, right? Nowadays, I can hire somebody. And that really has speeded up, in my opinion, the whole proliferation of ransomware and these extortion attacks that they're really just out to make a buck and then get out before law enforcement can catch them, you know?
Do you think that in some sense, while at the moment it might be increasing, but the fact that maybe that because the hacking is outsourced, that there's less hackers out, like that there's actually less hackers out there than might be imagined?
I think you make a good point. I think it's kind of going the other way. I think the people that can actually hack are getting paid crazy money now
Yeah,
because they're the subcontract, right? They're the guys that can actually do these attacks. And so whether the attack is successful or not, you're paying them up front,
yeah,
right? And so I think, especially the really sophisticated ones that potentially could be breaking into government organizations on behalf of, because even the nation states do it nowadays. I mean, sure, they have intelligence organizations to do it. Russia's a good one with the 26th election and all that. But the reality is they also subcontract this stuff out. And so I think they stand to make huge money, unfortunately, nowadays. And they take one step back from the actual risk, right?
yeah,
Because if the law enforcement's following the money and seeing where all this is going, that's not going back to those guys, right? They've
yeah.
got it set up so it's going back to the organization. And I think that's one of the new modern trends that makes this so hard when you actually try to look at attribution and say, where did this actually, come from? You know?
Yeah. So when even if you were able to determine this organization orchestrated the attack, none of them actually were involved. None of them actually committed the attack themselves.
That's exactly right. And it's interesting because, as you know, globally, this is a global problem. And it's almost like terrorism was, in my opinion, right after 9/11 for us, because I lived that inside the FBI and it monumentally changed the entire United States intelligence, or let alone just completely transformed the FBI. But my point is, prior to that, yeah, we have what was called legal attaches in countries all over the world, yes. But after 9/11, and definitely by the time I left way up high, I would talk to my counterparts in countries all over the world daily. And so when it comes to cyber, I really think we need like these global cyber norms, almost like the UN in a
Hmm.
war zone, right? Like, here's what the world's going to tolerate when it comes to cyber attack, whether it's criminal, nation
Yeah.
states, activists. And the reason I say that, I was in Australia probably a month ago, giving speeches in 3 or 4 cities down there for some companies. And if you look at what's going on in Australia, they are starting to get hit hot and heavy by major cyber. It almost reminds me of the US 10 or 15 years ago, where they are specifically targeting large scale companies for large money. But the reaction by the government is totally different than what I've seen here. And I think it merits some conversation is they've steadfast stepped in to help the companies and said, we're not paying anything,
Hmm.
right? You're not paying a dime, but we're going to come in and help you get your infrastructure back up and running. There's a
Yeah.
subtle difference there. Now, granted, much smaller economy and scale than what we do in the United States, but I thought it was very interesting. One of those attacks actually happened when I was down there. And the conversations I had with some pretty high ranking government officials when I was there was, we're just going to stand fast on not paying this, but we're going to come in and support the companies on the front end, not
Yeah.
worry about if they did something wrong or not. Let's just get them fixed. And so it's more part of that like global norm. What are we going to tolerate? And then how do we link together like we did in terrorism? Because I can tell you a large part of the world after 9/11 all came together and said, we're going to stomp this threat out. And,
Yeah.
we've done a pretty good job on it.
It's easy for a government entity to say, don't pay that ransom when they don't have to deal with the consequences of it.
Exactly. And when you're the CEO or chairman or chairwoman sitting there and you're trying to figure out how do I pay my 20,000 employees, right? How do I keep this company running? Your fiduciary responsibility
Yeah.
is to the stockholders or the investors in your company. And having been a chairman and CEO for the last 4 years, trust me, my thought process on this is different than it was, 8 years ago. And the reality is, I see a different picture, right, because of where they sit than I did when I was just a pure, government official. There's merit on both sides, obviously, but you get to see, like, hey, my responsibility legally is to this company, my shareholders, my employees. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so it's a different conversation. And I keep the point, and it's a hard one to do in the US, but how do you get companies that their first phone call is to somebody in the government? That we're not there yet. And
Yeah.
how do you make that happen? Now, don't get me wrong, I don't have all the answers, but that's where we need to get, I think, because it's just such a big problem.
I think in the U.S., unfortunately, the first phone call is to the lawyer of
100%.
is not who do we call to deal with this, but how little of this can we make public.
100%.
It's
100%.
it's the first call is damage control, not mitigation.
I'm in 100% agreement with you. And that is something I understand. But seeing this glimpse into Australia and some of the things going on in the UK right now is interesting to me because it's not how we've done it. And again, it's a smaller scale, so might be able to do it easier there, but it's interesting, at least to
Yeah.
talk about.
Well, hopefully, they're learning from our mistakes and how we've done it here in the U.S.
Yep. There's no doubt.
So I wanted to ask, like, being a cyber defense firm, do you believe that like your organization is being attacked by criminal organizations in a sense to thwart your attempts to help your customers or to find out who your customers are?
I, First of all, 100%, and our internal security team absolutely comes to work every day thinking we're going to get attacked. I will tell you the reason I think they would attack us is not necessarily to get our clients. It's more of a professional thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want to break into the firms that pride themselves on protecting other companies and then publicize that they've broken into those firms.
Yeah.
And so for us, obviously being a cybersecurity leader and coming into companies as the experts, you can't have that happen. And so when I say we have daily conversations about this, we do. And I like to have briefings with my team weekly on who's knocking on our door, why are they doing it. We talk a lot about third-party risk, right? Because you have a large scale between the 25-year-olds that are working in our SOC as a tier one analyst up to the guys like me that are closer to the 60 than 25. But the reality is anything you got on your phone, any social media app you got on your phone, any email that you have, and we all know everybody's lives are tied to their phone nowadays. That's all third party risk. So how are you managing that? Not necessarily to intrude on the employees,
Yeah.
but how do you keep your company safe? Um, and so we have a lot of conversations about this, but really for us, it's more of an image issue. They will try to hit our company, no different than large brands of cybersecurity companies around the US, so that they can say they broke into that place and then, kind of disparage you that way.
Yeah. A little bit of the ego trip.
100%. There's a lot of that out there. I mean, I'm better than you. I can get
Mm-hmm.
in. So
Do you find yourself personally on the paranoid side in terms of the way that you look at your devices, your computers, the electronics that you bring into your home?
I wouldn't say paranoid, but after 30 years of law enforcement and 8 years of doing this, answer is yes. So I use two-factor authentication on everything. And I can tell you, and this is a true story, you can call my CFO and ask her this right now. Uh, I don't open any email that I don't know who it's from. I delete it. And if it's important, guess what? You're going to email me back. And a true story was uh, about a year and a half ago, she sent me a DocuSign document. And it didn't come from her, it came from one of her staff. I deleted it.
Yeah.
I didn't even open it. And so about an hour later, I get this call. Hey, did you sign that document? I go, what document? She goes, we sent you a document. I go, unless you call me right before you send that. And by the way, the conversation takes 3 seconds. Sent you a document, sign it, Bob. I'm deleting it. And guess what? I haven't got a document sent to me since that somebody hasn't called me. And I know most people think, well, I don't have time for that. Oh, yes, you do. And if you don't, somebody on your staff does. And so I'm very, very particular on how I respond to anything like that because, unfortunately, I've been through it with so many breaches. Not me personally, but with the clients and partners that we've had over the years that have called us in to say, "Hey, how did this happen?" We come in forensically, look at it, and go, "Here's exactly how it happened." Most of that, as you well know, is conscientious employees, not people that are trying to destroy the company that they're busy with their daily life, their personal life, their professional life. They're just trying to get through work to go pick up the kids or do whatever. They click on something wrong and it's a disaster.
Yeah.
And so I have a pretty ironclad policy. Unless I know who it's coming from, I delete it. I already told you about the DocuSign stuff. And I really, really push any type of multi-factor authentication that anybody will do. I don't care how you do it. There's a million ways
Yeah.
to do it nowadays, but I think that cuts your risk significantly.
Are there steps that you take on bringing electronics into your home, or like some people be like, oh, I want an IP camera, for security on the outside of my house. Let's find the cheapest one on Amazon and throw it up in my house and connect it. I've got security now. Would you just buy a random camera off of Amazon, or what kind of due diligence would you do before bringing
Yep.
something like that into your home?
No, I think that's also a very nice point is, and it goes, unfortunately well beyond that now with thermostats and refrigerators you talk to in your car. So I don't do anything if I'm investing into that and you can guess, like I got cameras everywhere around my house, but uh, I always buy direct from vendors. I don't do anything off the internet. I don't bring anything in that isn't at least at the highest acceptable level of this is probably a pure product.
Hmm.
I am very cautious. I obviously shield my Wi-Fi. You can't get to it outside my house. There's ways to do that, and I do all that type of that stuff. And the other thing I will tell you this right now, and I see it all the time. It I'll just cut to the chase. It goes further. If I'm sitting in a lounge because I fly everywhere, I don't log on to the Wi-Fi. I
Yep.
use a hotspot, right? If I'm sitting on a train going to New York, I don't log on to the train. I use a hotspot. If I'm sitting at some well-known coffee shops because I know that's where a lot of bad guys sit, I don't do that. And I know we all do it out of necessity because you're like, oh my goodness, I got to get this email back. My boss is hitting me up. I'll just log on for a second. And you don't realize that potentially there's a guy or gal's been sitting there all day waiting for you.
Yeah.
And so I'm pretty diligent about it. We also obviously, and I don't want to get into particulars on camera, but do a lot of self-initiated testing of our own employees.
Hmm.
Won't get into what all that is just for security reasons, but I take it pretty seriously. And again, as you and I have talked, Chris, this is all on the proactive side, and this is so much easier
Yeah.
than dealing with a major catastrophe. And it's funny because I still get pushback from large scale partner clients about multi-factor authentication. Well, my team hates it. There's no way I'm going to get 50,000 people to do this. Oh, yes, you are. Trust me. It'll happen in a day. Just shut their email. You know what I mean? But it's funny. People push back on that. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And so it's the easier side of this, quite frankly.
I mean, it's challenging because we live in a society that is so much about convenience and
Right.
lowering barriers to entry, and security is an uphill battle against that because it's intentionally putting barriers to convenience in front of people.
That's right.
It's just trying to
That's
figure
right.
out How much barrier to convenience can I put in there before they start doing something stupid to try to bypass it?
No, 100%. And it's a balance, especially with phones nowadays, with the employee gap in age and stuff. And, some people live their whole life on social media, and you got to be careful. You don't want to take that away from them, right? There's a variety of different things you got to look at, but you just got to make people aware. I'll tell you one of the biggest things, if no one listens to a thing I say, educate your employees, your team, your staff. Educate them. It's the number one thing. That's the front line of every company, right? Whether it's your personal banking or it's your 10-person shop or 100,000-person shop, educating your employees to what the threat really is, right? Because that's who's going to stop most of this. Then you can put in all this other stuff you and I talked about, but that's a really big piece of this, I think, is just educating the employees that this is real. People do come in through social medias. People do come in through different connected devices, right? Third party risk is off the charts nowadays. You look at it easily. Like I go back to my analogy when I was a state trooper in 86. Well, if you had an alarm on your house and a bunch of lights back then, nobody burglarized you, right?
Yeah.
It's too hard, right? So they went to the next house. And that's the way you need to think of your organization, quite frankly, because notoriously bad guys aren't going to go out there and work real hard, right? They're bad guys. They want
Yeah.
an easy way in and an easy way out, and you want to make yourself the more protected of those people they're targeting.
Yeah, the more complicated of a target you are, you hope they're just going to go on to an easier target.
100%. And for criminal organizations, that's 100%. We get into these, targeted nation states. That's a different thing.
Yeah.
Criminal, 90% of what most people are dealing with, that people, you're 100% right. They're going to move on and they're going to go someplace else, and they're not going to come back.
So as we come towards a landing here, let's talk a little bit about the kind of the reactive side. Okay, if now that someone we've talked a little bit about it, but now that someone has been a victim of an intrusion into their network or ransomware,
Yep.
we talked about, yeah, you need to have outside, call outside counsel
Yep.
right away, call the
Yep.
government, call an appropriate government organization. What steps should companies be taking after the fact?
I'll tell you, I'd say three things. So if you're the guy or gal running the company, you have to have an internal and an external communication plan, right? You need to be able to talk to your employees and you need to be able to talk to your clients. And people go, oh, that's no big deal. Really? Remember, your email's down, right? All your email's down,
Yeah.
right? So how are you going to, then they stare at you, right? So there's ways to do all this, but internal, external communication plan. Make sure, again, if it's a ransomware, that you're getting really good guidance from a reputable law firm that understands cyber, ransomware, and where the laws are nowadays, right? And then the last thing, which unfortunately doesn't happen all the time, is after you fought through all that and you have been told or notified that your breach is contained, okay, you need to understand, is the bad guy, bad gal forensically really out of my company?
Yeah.
Too many times I can tell you that we've gone into post breach remediation, been told bad guy, bad gal was out of here 3 months ago. And while we're there doing some type of an assessment, bam, they get breached again. And it's not because the bad guy came back in, it's because they left a payload inside their system that forensically nobody found.
Yeah.
It's no different than putting a bomb on your desk that says, in 128 days, 12 hours, and 18 minutes, it's going to go off and send it back to the bad guys. And unfortunately, in the last year alone, I bet you we've seen three or four companies across the U.S. that have suffered this. Right? They've had the breach, they fought through it, they think they're remediated, they go about their daily business, and bam, the bomb goes off 6 months later. So that's the three things that I would do if I was the head of whatever corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can finesse it after that, but that's the big ones.
So this is kind of a little satire question here. What's your opinion on those public disclosures to customers of we value security followed by all the ways that they didn't value security notifications?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you got to make a statement. The one thing that I always say to boards and the people running the companies is, and we used to say this in the FBI all the time. What if whatever you just said? What if that just went into the New York Times, right? It just showed up in front of everybody. And so really you got, again, this is part of that proactive conversation, right? If you know something's broke, you don't need to necessarily have it fixed overnight, but you need to be moving in that direction, right? You need to be putting resources, money, people towards it to fix it. And I think it comes off a lot more professional, not so disingenuous, right? As kind of some of these things you and I have all seen in the media. And I think you really need to think about that up front, right? If we did have this, okay, this is the weak spot in our company. This is where they're going to hit us until we get it fixed. How should I communicate that to our internal audience, which is our employees, right? Because they're scared about, are they going to get paid? Is their healthcare no longer working? Blah, blah, blah. And then also to our constituents. And it's more complicated than people think, because when you actually start thinking about it, wait a minute, this is going to take some time. Yeah, it is. So push that out front, because you don't want to be the company that comes off in some of these things you just brought up where it's just like, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, we were breached. That's not how you want it,
Yeah. There was a vendor contractor organization that I work with that I recently received an email from them saying, as you've seen in the news, X vendor experienced a data breach. We use this service, and while there isn't the appearance that any of our data or your data is at risk, here are the steps that we're taking. And as you can, as you can see from the description of our steps, this is not something that we're going to be able to complete in the next 3 hours. This is something that's going to take us a period of time to do, and we just want to let you know what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I was like, this was a very it wasn't, hey, we were breached, but it was. I was really impressed because it was communicating. We're on top of something that happened. And we're doing our due diligence, and they're also setting an expectation of
they gave you a timeline, right? They give
which
you
is
a timeline.
awesome,
yeah, and that I agree with you. That is, and that that's the way it should be done, because now you know what's going on, they're working on it, and you have a timeline, and all of a sudden your worry goes down, right? And you don't even know what's happened yet, really. But that's the right way to do it, and then follow up on that. Don't just let it sit out there. Right. So whether it takes a week, a month, whatever, follow up on that.
Now I'll have to wait and see if they do that part. I think they will.
You got to follow up. That's the one thing. But the only other thing I would say in all of this, because honestly, going back to what you and I were talking about earlier, I mean, the potential for any, company nowadays to get breached is very high, right? It just is. And a lot of it's luck for the bad guy. A lot of times when they launch ransomware attacks, they don't even know who they've hit, right? Different than old school ransomware attacks that were very targeted. But it doesn't cost anybody a dime to sit around for an hour or 2 hours and go, who should we call for a law firm? How should we communicate this? By the way, if our email's down, how will we do it? Do we have a roster where we can text everybody? Right? It's just those kind of things. And it really will decrease the stress level on when something like this happens. I can't emphasize, and I know I said it a lot today, but I can't emphasize, because I've seen the back end of thousands of these things, and it's the same every time. I don't care how great of a company or bad of a company. It's a lot of stress on the executives. It's a lot of stress on the employees, the shareholders, and so anything you can do up front, it limits that.
When you're talking about how do we email if our email system is down, I was starting to think of well, gosh, what if the CRM was tied up in this ransomware? How are you going to even contact your customer? Where's my customer data? How am I going to get a hold of my customers to let them know there's an issue that they need to watch out for?
Yeah, it's a big issue, and you don't want your customers getting nervous, because your customers will leave, right? And so it's beyond, and I said it's beyond a business interruption. Like, if you have a large scale breach, this is a business crisis until it's handled. So your company needs to keep running, but your focus needs to be on this breach, right? Until it's remediated and you can come out and say exactly what was lost, taken, compromised, whatever. And here's where our plan to go forward, and we're back up, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, you can't forget about your internal clients and your external clients. And I've seen it both ways, where companies communicate really well internally, nothing external. I've seen it, usually it defaults to this. They communicate really well externally. They don't tell their employees anything, right? And if you've got, 10, 15, 20,000 employees, you need to communicate to them because they're going to be worried. And so it's not one or the other, right? You have to do both.
Yeah, whether they're customers, internal, external, people are going to start filling in the gaps themselves, the lack
Right.
of information, and they're going to fill it in with things that are not so good.
Right. Or wrong, just
Yeah.
flat out wrong, And so, and the last thing, I know we don't have a lot of time, but last thing I'll say, and I have been the expert witness in a lot of these things in the last several years, and some of these large scale breaches nowadays, unfortunately, when a big breach happens, within days, weeks, months, class action lawsuits are filed, right? These are billion-dollar lawsuits against companies. And what ends up happening is now the company's got a business crisis. You just got served with $1 billion class action lawsuit. In some cases, the employees now sue the company on top of that. Members of the board, yeah, we all got board insurance. I can tell you, you still get sued personally, right? And so this has changed the dynamic in this, right? And whether they're right, wrong, and different, this is something, and the whole cyber insurance side of this is a big deal nowadays. And so when people are trying to educate themselves about the cyber threat, don't leave this part of it out, right? If you don't do any of the things we've talked about today and you don't show that you're on top of it, unfortunately, this is what happened to your company. And it happens a lot nowadays.
Hmm.
And I don't, because a lot of these things aren't publicized until they're settled, and that could take years. But in the meantime, unfortunately, companies are spending millions of dollars defending themselves, and the stress of your employees pitted against the company, you know what I'm getting at. It just goes on and on and on. I don't think people talk about that enough. And I've seen the backside of a lot of these things. And so when people are looking at what's the overall threat, have this part of the conversation, internally
Yeah.
to the team. What if? Because that's definitely a side of this. You don't hear a lot in the news, but it's definitely happened.
That's the scary part. It's all scary, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's the lingering after scariness.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Robert, where can people find you online? Where can they find Cyber Defense Labs online?
Yeah, you can go to cyberdefenselabs.com, come to our website. There's all kinds of means to contact me. You can Google me. I'll pop up all over the place. I'm on LinkedIn, obviously. And all of my details are up on the website, along with the entire executive leadership team and the board and everybody else on cyberdefenselabs.com in Dallas, Texas.
And we will make sure to link those in the show notes so people can easily find them if they don't know how to spell Cyber Defense Labs.
There you go. Thanks, Chris.
Robert, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.